So I've started recording, so hi everyone watching after the fact. But hello to everyone that was able to join for this presentation on UX design requirements and user stories. This is part of our ongoing UX workshop series. This has been my baby during quarantine. Every Wednesday I come on here and I talk about a topic having to do with UX design. And so for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about how to do UX research and what that looks like. But once you have your UX design notes, you have maybe done some journey mapping, some persona building, you've done kind of the initial stages of UX research, and it's almost time for you to get into actually designing this software or whatever you're working on. So the very first thing that you're going to want to do is, sorry, I just want to make sure no one's in the waiting room or anything. Okay, we're good. So the very first thing you're going to want to do once you get to this page where you're ready to start designing, but you just need to first figure out what parts of the software you're going to tackle first. What is our MVP? What are the things that we're going to start designing? An MVP, if you guys don't know, it stands for minimum viable product. So in Agile, you usually are going to, when creating a new software, your goal is to get that MVP, that very beginning stages of a software, of an app, that is actually going to be usable by whoever is looking to use your software. Sorry, I'm just making sure. When you guys are joining, I thought I had it so that it would mute you guys when you got in, just because I don't want, weird feedback and stuff. But yeah, anyway, so we'll get on with the presentation. I did want to just give you guys the option. You are able to join me on Patreon if that's something you're interested in. I know that I usually give free tickets to these webinars, but if you are unable to get a free ticket every time because they do sometimes run out, one option is to do this $2 a month sign-up fee. And if you sign up for $2 a month, you will get unlimited access to all of my webinars. You'll get recordings of each webinar. You will get slide decks. You can have one-on-one communication with me if you want me to look at something or have a conversation with you about UX design. I'm available. And you also get access to my ebook, my 10-page guide on how to become a UX designer. So that's all included if you join me on Patreon. So I wanted to definitely just let you guys know that that was an option. I will type in the link to that in the chat at patreon.com/join/Fairbanks Studios. Okay, so that should work. You can also just search for Fairbanks Studios on Patreon. But today's requirements, or today's agenda on UX design requirements and user stories. First, we're going to talk about what requirements are and what user stories are, because they are different. We're also going to talk about practicing writing user stories. What does it look like when we write a user story from a raw data note? And then how do we actually validate that those user stories that we've written are the correct user stories according to our users, or what our users want, what our stakeholders want, and that sort of thing. So we're going to keep going here. We're going to briefly talk about the UX design lifecycle. I like to talk about this at the beginning of all of my webinars because it just kind of helps orient us in the design process. So we're still in this understanding needs section. This is the very first thing you're going to want to do when you start any sort of UX design project, whether you're starting a new software or you're revamping, redesigning an existing software. The first thing you're going to want to do is try to understand the needs of your client. So after you understand the needs of your client, you're going to be able to get into actually designing design solutions. So this workshop is right at the end of the understanding needs category. This is the point where we're actually going to start writing out our user stories, which are going to lead what our design is going to look like. Then we're going to get into the design solutions phase where we're actually going to start sketching and creating these mock-ups. Then we're going to want to prototype our best mock-ups and see what our users like and don't like, and what we should actually put into the software development process And then we're going to evaluate our UX designs. We're going to get user feedback. We're going to verify that what we created meets all the requirements of our user stories that we're going to talk about in a minute. And we're going to be able to refine our designs in order to make them the best they can be. And then after that, you're going to go back to understanding needs. So it's this cyclical loop that never ends, because once you create one version of software, you're going to want to go back to understanding what your client and what your users like and don't like about your software, and you're going to want to go back into the design phase all over again. So with software engineering, with software design, your job is never done. You're always trying to improve on your product. So within understanding needs, you have 4 main things that you're concerned with. The first thing you're going to want to do, and I've had workshops that cover all of these bases. So you're going to first want to collect your data, the data elicitation. Then you're going to want to analyze your data. So kind of parse out what information is most important from the data you have gathered from things like user interviews, from being on site and watching the system or product that you are redesigning be in use, that sort of thing. You're going to want to analyze that data. Then you're going to want to do data modeling. And so there are a couple of different ways to do data modeling. You may be familiar with things like journey maps or personas. Those are just kind of buzzwords that UX designers use. And what they mean when they say things like that is that they want to do some data modeling. They want to take the analysis that they have taken from the data analysis phase, and they want to actually put it into, oftentimes this looks like flow charts. This looks like graphics that are used to represent the most important aspects of your product or system that need to be improved upon. And it helps the whole team and your stakeholders and everyone get on the same page about what the product or system you're working on is actually accomplishing. So then we're going to get into user needs and requirements. So this is a way for us to take all of the data we've collected and analyzed and broken down and modeled, and actually start to write out what we're going to be designing in specifics. So that's the part we're going to talk about in detail today, is user needs and requirements. So the first thing I want to talk about is user stories. These are an agile way of capturing what it is to be designed. And you can see an example right here. This is a very typical kind of format for user stories. As a blank, I want blank, so that blank. This is very typical for anyone working in Agile. You'll see this kind of format a lot when you look at user stories. So let's talk about user stories. So user stories involve a bunch of different things. First, they involve user inputs. So we have already gathered feedback from our users in the data elicitation phase, and we've started to understand what it is that the user wants and needs. So these user stories are based on actual data that we have collected. They are stated in the perspective of usage. So actually looking at some of the data, if it's an existing system in particular, we are going to look at things like how people are currently using our system. If that data is available to us, we want to take that into account when crafting these user stories. We also want to state them from a customer perspective. So as you saw on the last slide, when we looked at an example of how these things are formatted, you'll see as a blank, as a user role, that's very important. So we're actually writing these in the perspective of the user. So we're trying to narrow down, okay, what is it that the user wants? And we're going to state it in that perspective so that we know that we are always designing for the user. And we know what this feature or what this thing that we're creating is for, and how it's going to help our user have a better experience. We also use user stories because they were made popular by Agile proponents. So this is a very Agile thing to do. And it's pretty, if you have a job as a UX designer in an Agile environment, you're probably going to see user stories being used. I try to look at the standards across the industry and look at what the experts were saying about how to use user stories and how to write them and how they are collected and kind of prioritized to create this presentation. Your specific company might do things slightly differently because every company is going to be slightly different depending on that specific customer or business's needs. But I tried to just take the best practices from the field and present them to you. So that's the way I've kind of created this presentation. They are the standard in the industry. Usually if you are a UX designer, you are going to get your requirements in this format, in this user story format. They're also focused on delivering chunks of meaningful capabilities to users. So user stories are meant to be completed in a pretty short time frame. They're pretty specific. They're not going to be something super broad like, as a user, I want to be able to shop online or to be able to purchase goods from an online store. They're not going to be that broad. They're going to be more specific so that you can actually get them done as a designer or as a developer within a pretty short frame of time. Scope. So I wanted to talk about a couple of UX agile buzzwords during this presentation that are important for you to recognize. And I think it's really helpful and beneficial if you know these terms before going into something like a UX design interview or working on an agile team, because you're going to hear words like this a lot. So scope is referring to delivery, and it describes how the target system or product is chunked or broken into smaller pieces in each iteration or sprint for delivery to the client and users for feedback and to the software engineering team for agile implementation. So the scope is the kind of the chunk size of what you're looking at here. Okay, so I want to talk about the difference between user stories and requirements, and why you would want to maybe choose a requirements approach or a non-agile approach as opposed to a user stories approach. Personally, I do like the user stories approach better. It is the more agile way to do things. It is the industry standard. Requirements, though, might be necessary in your process, depending on the company you're working for, the budget, different factors. Some of those factors that might lead you to have more formal, typical business requirements as opposed to user stories would be things like if you need to use a rigorous full scope approach, then you might have requirements in addition to user stories and just like take requirements as your kind of overall goal, but then maybe chunk down your requirements into user stories so that you can tackle them. Or if you are contractually obligated to do so. So basically, I just recommend doing the requirements route if you have to, based on the business you are working for. Otherwise, if it's up to you, or if you are making recommendations for your team, I would go with user stories because it's agile, it's the industry standard, and it's what most designers expect to be working with when they join a team. So requirements. What is a requirement? Requirements in the business sense, when we talk about requirements, requirements are immutable, they are absolute. They often follow the format that I have kind of displayed on the screen here, which is that you shall provide these features and functions, and you shall do it in the way that we say. As UX designers, it's helpful to take these requirements and not take them in absolutes if allowed by your client. Because it just leaves a little less room for things like creativity and flexibility with these constraints. And as UX designers, we want that flexibility and ability to be creative because we want to provide the best value and experience for our clients. A lot of times when businesses create these requirements, they are not taking into consideration all of the nuances that you as a designer might be more familiar with. And so if the client allows you to be flexible and creative and maybe create something that they had never thought of including, but that might be the key to unlocking this fabulous new user experience for your users, it's in the client's best interest to allow you that flexibility, and that's what user stories offer. Hard requirements that give you no flexibility kind of put a damper on, obviously that creativity. So that's why I don't like it when businesses give designers these really hard requirements. unless they're absolutely necessary. So that can be tricky to navigate, but obviously you have to do whatever your client wants. But if you're giving the recommendation, I would say try and push them towards the agile process, the agile methodology, which is going to be these user stories. So this represents the relationship between UX design requirements and UX prototypes as UX design representations for software engineering requirements. So you would, if you are working under this requirement structure, you're going to get your UX design requirements. You're going to funnel that through the Agile UX process. You're going to create these wireframe prototypes as UX requirements for software engineers. And then the software engineers are going to create the product. So what makes requirements hard? Why are these so difficult? I kind of touched on this before, but the basic reasons that requirements are so difficult on UX designers is because detailed formal requirements cannot ever be complete. In the software engineering world, it's we're doing a very iterative process, and the whole concept of agile is trying to create this minimum viable product and building on top of that and building on top of that and having all these versions of this design that are going to evolve and change and grow over time. And as your software evolves over time, your users are going to have different feedback, and you want to be flexible and adapt to whatever feedback you're receiving so that you're creating the best user experience possible. If you're given a bunch of formal requirements, you have less of an ability to actually listen to your users. And that brings me to my next point, which is that formal requirements can never be 100% correct. You might get halfway through the process of creating a software and then get feedback from a user that goes completely against one of these requirements that is given to you by the client. Detailed formal requirements cannot be prevented from changing throughout the life cycle. So they're not adaptable, they're not flexible. So that's why I prefer user stories. A user story is a short narrative describing a feature or capability needed by a user in a specific work role and a rationale for why it is needed. And it's used as a requirement in Agile UX design. It's the new and improved, better version of putting requirements on UX designers. So I want to run through a couple of examples of how you might take a raw data note and craft that into a user story. So this raw data note says, I think of sports events as social events. So I like to go with my friends. The problem is that we often have to sit in different places, so it is not as much fun. It would be better if we could sit together. So in this case, I'm taking an example here of a sporting event that someone is buying tickets to. So, and we're going to take the example of like a university kind of thing where I'm going to like a college sporting event. So if you take this raw data note and put it into a user story, we're going to put it into that same format that I showed earlier. So you're going to first put the user's work role. So in this case, we're talking about a student ticket buyer. The student ticket buyer wants, fill in the blank, a university basketball ticket option to get several seats together so that I can sit with my friends. So you have who the person is that is requesting the change, what the person wants, and then you have the so that, or the reason why they are requesting that change. So all of those reasons are really important. So you know who you're designing for, why you're designing it, and what exactly you're designing. All of those are really important questions when crafting a user story, and it's going to help you so much when you actually go to try and design something to solve a user's need. So this next raw data note says, I sometimes want to find events that have to do with my own personal interests. For example, I really like ice skating and want to see what kinds of entertainment events in the nearby areas feature skating of any kind. So this is another example that's kind of like a ticket buying system. If we put that raw data note into a user story, we're going to get, as a ticket buyer, I want to be able to search for events by event type or descriptive keyword. So here we're actually taking the person's want, but I'm making it more explicit and making it making it use language that actually is going to help me when I start designing. So I I want to find events. How are they going to find these events in the software world? Well, we have things like keywords or categories that we can create, events by event type. So those are just some good ways to put that into a user story so that I can actually start to picture the design in my head, right? Like I know how to have someone search by keyword or event type. That those are things I've seen before in the software world. So I understand that a little bit. It's a little less abstract than I want to find events. And then so that I can find the kind of entertainment that I like. That's their reason for wanting to have this software. We've got another raw data note for you, and this is my last example, I promise, but I think that these are really helpful just for understanding how to actually write a user story. So the raw data note here reads, I occasionally find it convenient to see recommendations for events that are similar to ones I like the listing of what others who looked at this item got from Amazon.com. So as a ticket buyer, that's our who is asking for this. As a ticket buyer, I want to be able to see recommendations for events similar to ones I find and like, so that I can find other events that I like that I might otherwise miss. So that's their reason for wanting this feature. So that's just a couple of examples of how you might create user stories from raw data notes. I think hopefully those were helpful in understanding how to actually write these things. So organizing user stories. In a project, you might end up with a lot of diverse user stories. How do we organize and prioritize these user stories? So once you've gone through all of your raw data notes, you're going to want to actually organize these user stories so that you can actually start tackling these. What order are we going to tackle these user stories in? So the first thing you might want to do is start grouping your user stories. There are software applications for this. If you've ever used something like Jira, Jira is an example of a software system that allows you to group user stories into different epics. An epic is just a category. It's just a term in Jira that you might have heard before if you're familiar with that software. If you're not familiar with Jira, no worries. You can just think of it as taking your user stories and grouping them in ways that make sense. So here we kind of have our flow chart of our ticket buying process. At the top, we have buy tickets, find event of interest down here, find desired number and location of seats. And then you've got under events of interest, you have all these different options. You want to browse events, search events, peruse event info and reviews, or you might want to make a purchase. If they make a purchase, you might select payment type. You might confirm, sign, or take your tickets. Under something like search or browse, you might see a bunch of user stories having to do with browsing or having to do with searching. And then below that, you have user stories for finding events. So you might kind of separate your stories into these categories just based on this flow chart of our software. And just trying to categorize things in a way that makes sense for your team, and chunk them up so that you can tackle them and work on a feature, one feature at a time. So here's a sprint. A sprint is another important agile term to know, just like scope. Sprints are relatively short, not more than a month time period within an agile software engineering schedule in which a working and reliable releasable product increment is implemented. So in my experience, sprints are typically about 2 weeks, and it's enough time for you to actually complete a user story. So you want your user stories to be specific enough that you can solve them in whatever length of time your sprint is going to be. So if it's going to be a 2-week sprint, you want user stories to be specific enough that you are able to tackle them within that 2-week sprint. So here's just an example of what the sprint looks like. I just got this off of Google Images, but you have your sprint here. Here's your backlog. So the backlog has, this backlog right here has all of your user stories in it. And then you have your sprint backlog, which is the specific tasks that you are going to complete within that, say, 2-week sprint. So these are your, couple of stories you're going to complete in your 2-week sprint. These are all of your stories. So this is like it could be tons and tons of stories, and you might be constantly writing new ones as you get more user feedback. So these are the ones you're going to tackle within this specific sprint. You're going to want to go into planning first. So this is just based on my experience and what I have read about Agile methodology, but things might be slightly different depending on your product or team. But typically in a sprint, you're going to have a couple of different times, like kind of periods of time within the sprint. So you've got sprint planning, which is going to set up the plan for the sprint, what you're going to get done. Then the implementation is kind of the longest phase. That's the part where you're actually going to be designing and doing the things that are going to get your work done. Many teams have a daily Scrum, which is just kind of like a daily check-in to see how everything's going. If there are any blockers, anything that a blocker is something that might prevent you from doing your work. It's more of a development term, but it's good to be familiar with because a lot of times as a designer, you're working with developers, so it's helpful to know that term as well. Once you're done with the implementation phase, you're going to go into the review phase where you're going to start doing things like testing if you're a developer, or reviewing the designs if you're a designer. Retrospect is kind of this thing that happens at the end of a sprint where you reflect on what you got done and where you can improve. Completed features, that's everything that should be completed at the end of the sprint. So all of your sprints that you have chosen to be in the sprint, all of your stories that you have chosen to be in the sprint should be completed at the end, which should lead to a completed product. So at the end of the sprint, hopefully you have gotten all of your stories done and you are able to release something to your client or to your users that is going to be usable. It's going to add to the user's experience. It's going to complete the task that you guys set out to complete in the first place. I'm gonna pause and drink some water. So, validating user stories and requirements. After user stories or requirements are gathered and organized, it's a good idea to take them back to users and other stakeholders to make sure they're right. It's also a good idea to take some time to coordinate between members of your team so that everyone is on the same page and will be following the same plan. This initial stage of validation will need to be revisited and stories will need to be reprioritized often as every 2 weeks. I just say to every 2 weeks because that's like the sprint length I'm familiar with. It might be 3 weeks to you, whatever the length of the sprint is. This initial stage of validation will need to be revisited and stories will need to be reprioritized often. Also, another term that you might hear is grooming. This reprioritization is often called grooming. So that's just another Agile term that you might hear thrown around. But anyway, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you guys so much for participating. This is a difficult thing to cover because I feel like the Agile process does kind of change, and the requirements creation or the user story creation really is going to change depending on what team you're working on. But I thought it was helpful to just kind of share some of the common terms you might hear in these kinds of roles, as well as just kind of show you you know, what a user story looks like and how you might go about creating those. How many stories do you usually have in a sprint? Oh, I'm going to go into your questions, by the way. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording so that I can